I'm having a fangirl moment here. I would really like to introduce someone. My Dog is My Home is extremely excited to bring to the conference to speak to this year's conference theme, Stronger Together, Building Allyship Between Movements. He is someone who embodies leadership in the work to end and prevent homelessness, improve animal welfare, and he was the first to explicitly bring it to a national conversation, how human homelessness and animal welfare overlap. He did this by releasing the PAW Plan in the 2020 presidential race as a platform, no less. Julian Castro has distinguished himself as a strong leader and successful public servant for nearly 2 decades. A former Democratic candidate for president, Castro served as the 16th Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Barack Obama from 2014 to 2017, and as mayor of San Antonio from 2009 to 2014. At HUD, Secretary Castro managed 8,000 employees and a budget of more than 46 billion with a B, and has led progress at the department that earned it recognition as one of the most improved federal agencies. Secretary Castro also co-chaired the United States delegation to the United Nations Habitat 3 conference, spearheaded efforts to reduce homelessness, and created Connect Home, a public-private partnership to deliver broadband to public housing residents. Previously, as mayor of America's 7th largest city, Castro brought a strong focus to expanding educational achievement and making San Antonio a leader in the 21st century global economy. Under Castro's leadership, San Antonio implemented Pre-K4SA, a high-quality early childhood learning initiative that has earned praise as one of America's strongest public pre-kindergarten programs. Secretary Julian Castro, it is my pleasure to welcome you to My Dog is My Home's Co-Sheltering Conference as this year's opening keynote speaker. This is truly an honor. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thanks for that introduction. More importantly, thank you for your fantastic advocacy as one who has been so vocal as a great advocate on issues of making sure that everybody in our nation has safe, decent, affordable housing. I want to give a shout out to everybody who's watching today, who's part of this great conference that My Dog is My Home is putting on co-sheltering. And as Carol said, and as y'all have in the name of your program, really building allyship and strengthening both of these movements by working together. Let me just start off by saying that, it's special for me to be here for a few different reasons. First of all, like probably every single person on this Zoom, I'm an animal lover. Some of my earliest memories are of growing up with my mother and my grandmother on the west side of San Antonio. And my grandmother, she had at one time, I think like 11 cats that she lovingly tended to. And treated them like they were part of our family. And so my brother Joaquin and I got very familiar and attached to many of those cats over the years. And then later, growing up, I had dogs, mostly myself. Most recently, a little Chiweenie. Many of y'all will know a Chiweenie is like part Chihuahua and part Dachshund, that I named Bull. And so Bull, fortunately, was a very lively, active dog who didn't bark too much, which can be a tendency of Chihuahuas. I got lucky. It's also special for me because as someone who loves animals, I'm so proud of the work that the advocates on this call are doing to make sure that we further animal welfare and protection in the United States. And in local communities across our country. I'm going to touch a little bit more on that in a few minutes, but I'm glad to be here among so many people who have a passion for this and who are making it possible for animals out there to be treated better all over our country. And finally, it's special because this conference is about the intersection of another issue that I'm passionate about, which is making sure that everybody has housing in our country. I believe that housing should be treated as a human right, that we should work from that premise, that we should build policy around that and invest in our nation's affordable housing crisis in that way. And I know today on our Zoom that we have a number of different advocates who have dedicated their professional career to making sure that people in their community are housed and impacting policy to further affordable housing opportunity. It's especially important because I don't have to tell the folks on the Zoom that we had an affordable housing crisis before the pandemic, and we have an even stronger one now. These last 2 years, it's fair to say, have been unlike anything else that any of us has ever lived through. Probably unlike anything else in human history. In a couple of weeks, we're going to hit the 2-year anniversary of what has brought us a pandemic that has killed more than 900,000 people, a recession that came along with it, that put a lot of people out of work, that left millions of people behind on rent and millions facing eviction around the country. A racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And most recently, what we see overseas, a war in Europe that reminds us of the past and stirs up so many of those emotions for folks who grew up in the Cold War and are wondering about the future, not only of Europe, but also our world. Through all of this, not only have people been affected, but also our animals. When you talk about a recession, when you talk about all the loss of human life, that has had an intimate impact on our pets and non-domesticated animals as well. All of that put together, all of these last 2 years, and I know we've lived through it, and everybody has been in some way affected by it, some more than others, but everybody has been affected by it. I don't know about you, but sometimes, it's enough to get you a little bit depressed. Well, if that's the case, today I'm going to bring what I see as good news, some hope for actual progress on both of these issues that we all care about. I want to tell you the story of 2 successes because they're relevant to our conference and because they provide both a blueprint for improving opportunities for housing and also improving animal welfare and the intersection of those issues. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, as I mentioned, with my mother and my grandmother and my twin brother, Joaquin, who today represents about half of San Antonio in Congress. I used to describe, when I was mayor of San Antonio, the city as a city that, even though it was over 1 million people, still had a small town feel to it. The kind of place where if 2 people pass each other by on a street downtown, that they still look each other in the eye. There was still a sense of openness and of connection, and many, many folks who had grown up there and made their lives there. A beautiful city infused with the Mexican-American culture. Many of y'all have probably been to San Antonio, to the Riverwalk, maybe the Alamo. You've eaten some good Tex-Mex, hopefully had a margarita on the Riverwalk. It's a very charming city. There are so many things that I was proud of, both growing up and then when I served on the city council and served as mayor of the city. In so many ways, that city had achieved a good balance between the opportunities that big cities often afford and also the quality of life that people often seek in smaller communities. But in 2004, I was reminded of one of the worst parts of the community that I had grown up in. In the spring of 2004, the local paper, the San Antonio Express News, published a series of articles that were headlined "Death by the Pound." The Death by the Pound series was about the astronomical numbers of dogs and cats that were being euthanized at the San Antonio Animal Care Services facility. And when I say astronomical, I mean tens of thousands every year. At the time, San Antonio had about 1.1 million people, and the city was euthanizing as many animals as Los Angeles, which had 3 or 3.5 times more people at that time. It had a euthanization rate that was among the highest in the nation. That article detailed in a very tragic way, sad way, the problem that we had in my community with so many, especially dogs, that were roaming the streets, that ended up in a facility that was principally designed to euthanize them, with anemic efforts at that time to get them adopted, to find them a home, to set up partnerships with networks of organizations that could do that. And for me, it comported with what I had seen growing up. I remember walking around my neighborhood streets and seeing packs of dogs roaming around, and that was almost a joke among the kids. The which gang of dogs controlled each block. In 2004, when this Death by the Pound series came out, I was a city councilman. And what I decided to do at the time was to hold a series of public meetings to get input from the public and also experts on what we could do in our community to change, to fix that problem, by making sure that we drove down our euthanization rate and pursued a no-kill status. Over the next several years, during the time that I was a council member and then mayor, and over actually several mayoral administrations, San Antonio ultimately became a no-kill city. What it took was a reimagining of what we did when we found a cat or a dog on the street, or one was turned in at Animal Care Services. We struck up partnerships with the Humane Society, with adoption groups. We increased funding for spaying and neutering. We also worked on what I called at the time a culture of discardability that existed among too many residents, of almost not thinking twice about the fact that animals were out there on the street that they had as pets and lost, or the dog or the cat ended up having babies and they ended up in the Animal Care Services facility. This culture of discardability, of people not taking seriously what was happening to these animals. And so part of our effort was a public education campaign as well, to help ensure that people would be more responsible pet owners. Through the years, eventually, we did achieve no-kill status by doing all of those things. What it showed me was that public policy and advocacy can make a difference, not only as it relates to policy around people, but also as it relates to policy around animals. So that's the first example. The second example is from a few years later. President Obama appointed me to HUD in the summer of 2014. And when I arrived at HUD, he made clear, along with First Lady Michelle Obama, that one of their biggest priorities was ending homelessness in the United States. In 2010, the administration had released what it called Opening Doors, which was unique as a federal blueprint on homelessness, because it said, we don't just want to reduce homelessness, we actually want to end it, starting with veteran homelessness. And so from 2010 through the end of the administration, that became the central priority of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Not only that, through the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, USICH, 19 federal departments were brought together to think through how they could coordinate their efforts to bring down the numbers of unhoused individuals in our country. Through the First Lady's Mayor's Challenge to end veteran homelessness, more than 800 local and state officials signed up to pursue an end to veteran homelessness in their own communities. On top of that, both at the federal level and the local level, best practices were identified and they were pursued. Things like Housing First and coordinated entry and the use of by name lists and information sharing among different agencies and departments. So that between 2010 and 2016, veteran homelessness in this country fell by 47%. Now, I acknowledge, and President Obama acknowledged back then, that 47% was not 100%. But think about that. During those 6 years, the administration reduced veteran homelessness by almost half. On top of that, it also sought to address how we could reduce family homelessness and chronic homelessness and youth homelessness. It identified common approaches. What we found, like a lot of the folks, the advocates on housing can attest, I'm sure on this Zoom, is that you absolutely need to make sure that somebody is housed. But it's also about being mindful of their quality of life and providing supportive services to make sure that not only are they housed, but they're also stable and they're able to pursue the kind of life that they want. Oftentimes that means things like mental health services and education services and access to transit and other opportunities. Here's where this conference comes in, as many of you know. It also meant taking account of the relationships that homeless individuals have. As you heard just a few minutes ago, very powerful testimony. Those relationships are not only relationships with other human beings, they're also relationships with their pets. I saw that very clearly in my travels as HUD secretary. I spoke to folks who were unhoused in places like Los Angeles' Skid Row, in New York. I spoke to folks who had just become housed in places like Philadelphia and Salt Lake City and San Francisco. One of the things that I heard over and over again during those travels to about 100 different communities in my 2.5 years as secretary was the importance to them of their pets. I had several folks tell me along the way, in fact, that they wouldn't go to a shelter if the shelter didn't allow their pet. You could tell that that relationship was not a surface level relationship, but a deep bond between human being and their pet. And so much so that it affected their decisions about housing and about healthcare and availing themselves of other resources. What that means is that oftentimes it's urgent that our housing advocates and our advocates for animal welfare work together to help improve the quality of life of human beings and also of animals. I thought about all of this a couple of years later as Carol mentioned in the introduction, when I decided to run for president. When I was mayor of San Antonio, as we were going through this experience that I described on a visit to some of the domestic policy people at the Obama White House before I was HUD secretary, I had suggested that they take up animal rights and investing in animal care, because I'd seen our experience in San Antonio, and I thought that it was both good policy and also good politics. When I got to HUD, I wondered why, even though we dedicated money for community development block grants and for shelter for people, we didn't allocate resources for animal care shelter or other programs through HUD and create a link that would recognize the value of co-sheltering. When I got to run my own campaign, I thought it was finally time in full to draw out the policy and investments that I thought that we should make as a country to recognize this bond, this link. And so we released what we called the PAW Plan. Now, I have to tell you that a lot of folks on the campaign, when I proposed that we release a plan on animal welfare, kind of scratched their heads and asked me, what in the world are you talking about? You know, you're not running for mayor again, you're running for president. Usually when you're running for president, you release a plan on Social Security and on any number of things. On, our immigration plan got a lot of attention. My plan on police reform, on job investment, and so forth. People don't, the first thing that people think about when they think about federal candidates is not necessarily animal welfare. But I had seen that powerful link between housing and animal welfare. And I thought that we could not only include that, but we could go beyond that to lay out a blueprint for ensuring a more just society, compassionate society overall that includes humans and animals. So the PAW Plan included everything from banning trophy hunting to creating a $2 billion wildlife reserve fund, to investing in better adoption programs and spaying and neutering, and in animal care facilities across the United States, and also in making sure that public housing and also publicly funded shelters had pet-friendly policies in place that would help ensure that more people who are homeless would actually avail themselves of those programs, and at the same time would benefit their pets too. And you should have seen the faces of the staffers who had doubted, because the whole time, when they wondered why I was insisting that we put together this PAW Plan, they doubted that it would even make a blip. They thought people would sort of pass it over. But I have to tell you, and if you ask those former staffers, they would tell you how surprised they were at the outpouring of support that we got for the vision, for the policy details, and basically for, I think, this overdue sense of attention that the issue of caring for our animals in this country, ensuring that they're treated better, how much attention that received from the public. When you're running for any office, you get these emails, or these days, direct messages over Twitter or on Instagram, and they say, oh, I'm going to vote for you for X, Y, and Z. Sometimes they say they're not going to vote for you. We got more messages that said, I'm going to support you because of what you've done as a candidate on animal welfare than on any other single policy that we put out. And so when I think about the successes that I mentioned to you, and I think about where we're headed as a country and the time that we've been through, I see some parallels and I think some lessons and pieces of advice that I hope that folks will take. What those two successes, San Antonio's success in getting to no-kill status, and also the Obama administration's success on driving down the number of homeless veterans, what they had in common were many things. First of all, strong advocacy. Communities, people, organizations that have been pushing and pushing, have been doing their best to highlight these issues, who haven't given up, even in the lean times, even when there's not budget money that's allocated at the local level or the state level or the federal level that you think should be, even when the attention is on other issues. Both of the issues that we're talking about, whether it's housing or it's animal care, welfare, and protection, both of them share the reality that they're never the glamorous issues for policymakers. They're never the ones that are on the news. They're hardly ever the ones that get the most attention. They're never mentioned in a political debate. Think about that. How many times have you seen in a debate for president or debate for governor or even a debate for mayor, these issues brought up? So there was strong advocacy. There was also a serious identification of best policy practices. As I mentioned, in the case of the Obama administration's success on homelessness, it was through what places like Salt Lake City had done with housing, in LA with Housing First. In San Antonio, we looked up the road 75 miles to what Austin had done in driving down the numbers of euthanized animals there. They had reached no-kill status before we did. And so there's a advantage to those organizations, those advocates, and also those elected officials who pay close attention to the best practices out there, who challenge conventional wisdom, who base policy on evidence and then push that. Another common feature was that things only worked because the public sector, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector worked together. In the case of driving down homelessness, it was the administration working with other local and state government officials, but also nonprofits around the country that were providing wraparound services, these supportive services to homeless individuals, as well as the private sector that, of course, builds affordable housing units and also got engaged in other ways in providing support. In San Antonio, in a similar way, nonprofits that help with adoption, with free spaying and neutering, with public education efforts, and the private sector as well. And so it's a lesson about ensuring that those connections are strong as you advocate going forward. Because there's only so much that the public sector can do alone, the private sector can do alone, or as I'm sure many of you know, there's also a limit to what the nonprofit sector can do, which is often challenged with limited resources and doesn't have oftentimes the scope or the authority that the public sector does. So as we look at the opportunity to work together, to lift up co-sheltering, to change policy so that public housing and shelters are more animal friendly, I hope that each set of advocates on this Zoom will take the notion of working together seriously. If you're a housing advocate and you're concerned about making sure that all of those supportive services are in place, what have you done to reach out to nonprofit groups in your community that are working to deliver spay and neutering services or offer other animal care services that someone who is unhoused can avail himself or herself of? Is that something that is in the offering that you bring to the table for the people that you serve? If you were an animal care advocate, have you made a connection with public sector, nonprofit sector, or private sector folks who provide housing opportunity? Oftentimes, the people who need your services the most are individuals with pets who are low income, who don't have a place to stay, who are seeking shelter. And because of their circumstances and their deep affection for their pet, oftentimes they're holding themselves and holding their animal back from improving the health care that they receive and improving their quality of life. This is an opportunity in this conference to think through those ways that you can work together. And there are a lot of different ways that you can. We're also in a time where you have a moment to seize. Because we've gone through these last 2 years, I hope, Americans recognize more, feel more than they have in a long time that all of us are in this together. And fortunately, to my point of view, during the last year and a half, Washington has reflected that. There are federal investments coming down the line that we haven't seen in generations through the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure plan, and perhaps some parts of President Biden's Build Back Better initiative. That may or may not happen, but chances are that at least some of that will get done within the next couple of years. What that means is that communities across the country, local communities across the country, and state governments are going to get resources that they can potentially use on housing and also on animal care and welfare. It's a great opportunity to show up at your local city budget meetings. Show up at the county council's budget meeting to make your voice heard. I found very clearly as a local city councilman and mayor and later in the federal government that it's true what they say, that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. A number of different times in my career in public service, I saw the difference that was made by well-organized and persistent and loud advocates for a cause. I saw decisions about money and also about policy totally change from the way that they were going in the first place because of that advocacy. Well, all over our country, no matter what city you live in, they're going to be having public hearings to make decisions about policy and about spending resources that hold out the hope to improve policy around co-sheltering, to improve affordable housing opportunity, and also to improve animal protection. Seize that opportunity over the course of the next 6 months when you have the time, if you're able to, both as an individual and also the member of an organization that I'm sure y'all belong to, that's on the ground doing advocacy. And finally, I hope that this conference, this gathering, is a wonderful opportunity to network, to hear about new ideas, to be inspired by the testimony of some of the great speakers that you're going to be hearing from, and also to learn new things from some of the advocates and the experts. All of that. but also I hope to reflect a little bit on why you went into all of this in the first place. If you're someone who works with people who are unhoused, the satisfaction that you get when you're able to help find them shelter, the compassion that you have for them, and the passion that you have for making a difference in their lives. If you're a veterinarian or an animal advocate, why'd you choose that path? I bet it's because you have a love for animals and you want to see them treated with kindness and compassion and with respect. The thing is that everybody wins when we work together across these silos that we too often build up. Neither people nor animals live their lives in issue silos. The challenge for all of us is to work across those silos so that we can make a greater impact on providing a better quality of life for our fellow human beings and also for their furry friends. I want to say thank you to My Dog Is My Home for its fantastic advocacy, for putting this conference together, and especially to each and every one of you for being in the fight of making this a more urgent matter in our country, of finding solutions, of deploying best practices, and ultimately of creating an America that is more just and more compassionate and more humane for humans and for animals. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Secretary Castro, for all of your leadership and for inspiring this community with your words. We have had the chat going crazy. So we have a few questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but just really thank you for allotting some time for us. So what are some legislative or policymaking barriers that prevent action to more inclusive housing? For example, is there an information gap or other considerations that we can work to counter?
Yeah, I think in your question, you sort of hint at one of those. I think for a lot of organizations, it was something new. You know, I would say it was something new. It was something that's not traditional, that they had not, employed before. And so when you're talking about inclusive housing, you're talking about co-sheltering, it's something that they often needed a push on, whether we're talking about housing authorities or other housing providers. I also think that just to take the example of housing authorities, for instance, they're often very sensitive to competing voices, right, and residents' concerns. We saw that clearly when we tried to ban smoking in public housing. You would think that would be kind of, at this point, a no-brainer. But they had residents that said, no, I have to smoke in my apartment and, I can't smoke anywhere else. On this issue, you have folks that say, I don't want to hear dog barking. I'm afraid of animals. And look, everybody must be respected and you need to take everybody's input. But those that you ask, what are some of the barriers? The others are concerns about liability, about costs, maintenance costs and so forth, those types of things. What it boils down to is that, and this is where the advocacy community comes in, right? People need to be able to be educated, and there needs to be reality testing, and folks who have dealt in these environments to be able to demonstrate that, hey, you're going to be fine adopting this policy, making a change, pursuing co-sheltering.
Yeah, that's all really great. I run a housing authority in New Jersey, so totally agree with everything you said. How would you feel? This is one of the questions that came up in the chat about adding a pet question to the annual point in time count. And I saw it and I'm like, that's actually a great idea. That's not something here in New Jersey that we document.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I bet that you would probably have a pretty high percentage of unhoused individuals who have a pet. I think all of us who have had some experience working with people who are unsheltered, or even people who are sheltered but are not in permanent housing. I mean, you can just see that, right? And you hear the stories and you can see it with your own eyes. I think if we had some way to measure it, that would help actually change policy. And so I'm all for that. That's a good idea.
I feel like it's low-hanging fruit. How can state and federal government influence local government sheltering efforts to be more pet friendly? I'll use this example in New Jersey when I ran the COC. They said that a service animal could only be a dog or a small pony here in New Jersey. And I just thought that was insane. I'm like, okay, so I can bring a pony in, but I can't bring my pet rabbits or my cats. So
yeah, well, I've often advocated for, first of all, I think we need a sound federal approach on it. Of course, the federal government, is not going to be able to dictate every point of policy to state and local communities, and nor should it. But I do think we can incentivize the adoption of pet-friendly policies in state and local communities, whether that's money that comes down through the USDA or through HUD or other monies. I'm a big fan of trying to incentivize states and local communities to do better. And so I'd say that's one way to approach it. Also, in state legislatures, they have a lot of sweeping authority with resources that they invest from their own state coffers to impact local communities. And then in local communities themselves, like those are really the laboratories of flexible policymaking. So if you have mayors out there, city council members that want to take up this issue and become more progressive on it, I think that also is a great place to start, because it's easier to do than getting a state legislature to vote on something, or certainly, as gridlocked as Congress is these days, or even getting a rule done through one of the agencies. Getting something done at the local level that can then be seen as role model policy for other places is a good place to start.
So you shared the reaction you got when you released your pause plan. People in the United States, we love animals. Most folks have them, and it seems like the support for animal welfare and animal rights is a broadly reaching issue these days. Given the huge numbers of people that want to see better protection for animals, it does seem like maybe electeds or policymakers are missing an opportunity to really engage this large constituency. Or maybe it's the other way around. Are we as animal advocates not engaging our elected officials or policymakers enough to make them understand that there is a need? Definitely there's a need for data. But what are your thoughts on this and how we can have them see animal issues as also something that they should add to their political agendas like you did?
I think it works both ways. I think that advocates need to spend more time when people are running for office, when they're still candidates at each level, local, state, and federal, going to those town hall meetings, asking them about these questions, because otherwise I think it just flies over the, or let's say under the radar screen of a lot of people running for office. And at the same time, policymakers need to I think, pay more heed to a group of advocates that actually is very, very large and is very vocal. Maybe has not been as present or as organized as some of the bigger groups that we see that organize in Washington, D.C. But is still, I found, a very big and growing and vocal group. And so my hope is for those who are policymakers that they'll actually take these issues more seriously. I was encouraged about a week and a half ago, I read that they're starting a congressional pet caucus. Folks may have seen that. So they're starting a congressional pet caucus. That is a great place to put your efforts now in terms of Congress, but also maybe trying to get that replicated in state legislatures around the country, because they have their own caucuses, right, on issue groups, just like they do in DC. That I think that's a good blueprint, because then what you have is you have this identified group of legislators in that chamber that you can go to for leadership and to get the ball going, kick the ball. That's often the hardest part.
Definitely. Thank you. Secretary Castro, can you speak as to how we collectively as a country address affordable housing shortages for upper low income families, lower middle income families, sort of this tension between stagnant wages, lack of supply, rents are astronomical again, and the impacts that this also has on subsidized housing. It seems like such a challenge to push for inclusive housing when we don't nearly have enough affordable housing in the first place.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Look, our nation needs to have a much bigger, bolder commitment to affordable housing opportunity. At one time in the Build Back Better plan, there was $113 billion that was set out for affordable housing investment. That would have been the biggest allocation that we've seen in generations. It doesn't look like anything near that is going to happen, right? What we need are massive investments in every type of housing opportunity that is out there, whether it's providing shelter for people who are homeless. I think public housing still has an important role to play, to tax credit housing, all of those different types of opportunities, because we need to create more units out there. We also need to work on things like land use policy in local communities, where oftentimes NIMBYism and other dynamics have prevented an adequate number of affordable housing unit investments, and it just makes it harder and harder for people to access affordable housing and for those units to be developed in an affordable way. So at the local level, there's a role for that, and then state housing finance agencies have a role to play as well in making good policy so that you ensure there's as much affordable housing as possible that reaches extremely low income individuals. These are folks that make less than 30% of the area median income, and they're like the hardest people to house and where there's the biggest gap in terms of housing availability. All of those levels, local, state, and federal, require greater investment and tweaks in policy to ensure that more units are out there, and especially more units that are available to the most vulnerable people.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, again, in being outside of New York City, it's hard when you see so many units sitting vacant, and you see our homeless numbers increasing every year. And it's more beneficial to landlords, I guess, or these huge luxury developers, to keep a unit empty or to Airbnb it versus providing it to a needy family to stay in their community. One thing that came up a lot in the chat is about insurance. How can we help organizations navigate their insurance as they want to do more co-sheltering or pet inclusive services? So again, it's this thing about liability that might be something that providers are seeing as a huge barrier to expanding services to include pets because of this, this fear.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's an opportunity here, right, for the public sector and the private sector to work together to help ease some of that concern and to perhaps provide funds for that kind of insurance. I personally, I think that if we went through the numbers, probably that's more of a fear than a reality, right? But still, look, when you're dealing in policymaking, you've got to address people's fears, their concerns, because all it takes is one incident, right, for the tables to turn on people's willingness to have these inclusive policies. I'm not aware of who's doing this well. You've given me some good homework to go and look at, but because I think it's that part of it is fairly new. But I do think that there's a role for both the private sector and the public sector, and I don't see this as something that can't be overcome.
So whether it's your stances on immigration, housing, or animal welfare, you seem to be driven by a desire to make sure everyone has the foundation to prosper and at the most basic level, a place to call home. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience and really what influenced your focus on that?
I guess partly how I grew up. My brother Joaquin and I. Joaquin says the way to tell us apart is that I'm a minute uglier than he is, but I'm a minute older, and we're twins, and we grew up, in a single parent household, and also with my grandmother who had come from Mexico as a 6-year-old orphan, and grew up relatively low income, and then had the chance to go on to college and law school and be the first in our families to become professionals. And so I feel like I've been able to, reach my dreams through my family's hard work. And that's what I want for everybody else. And in this country, that's become more and more difficult oftentimes for people that work very hard to see themselves, much less their children, go on and achieve their dreams. And so I think in this nation that what we have to always be vigilant about is ensuring that American dream that we've always spoken about doesn't get so far out of reach that this country is fundamentally different from the country that our parents, grandparents, and those before really knew and helped build. And I see all of these things like affordable housing opportunity, educational opportunity, making sure that we approach policy with compassion and humanity as central to that.
This is why you're such a great public servant and leader. And you've approached your work through this lens of hope and creativity because your family was able to have hope and, achieve their dreams. But much of what is said in relation to people experiencing homelessness is that the problem is too big and it's too challenging to solve and we're never going to fix it. It is also often said that the goal to ensure everyone has good and fair housing is unrealistic and that the changes needed to achieve it are too cumbersome or expensive. So I need some of your ray of positivity. How do you, as a thought and policy leader, continue to break through the naysayers of these obstacles?
Well, look, it's not too expensive. Okay. Toward the end of his administration, President Obama had put forward an $11 billion plan over 10 years to end family homelessness. Remember, we reduced veteran homelessness by 47%. We know a lot of what works. I mean, there's stuff we can still learn, but we know a lot of what works. We can drive those numbers down. That's $11 billion over a decade. The defense budget this past year was $787 billion. Now, without regard to debating the defense budget, and certainly we're watching on the other end of the world, that sometimes, you need investments there for sure. But my point is, it's very affordable if it's a priority. And if you match resources that are within our reach and smart policy along with smart implementation, then I don't think that it's far-flung to say that we can functionally end homelessness in the wealthiest nation that has ever existed on the face of the earth.
Yep, I say it loud and say it proud for everyone to hear. Trying to see if there's one more. We are so appreciative of your time here with us. What's up next for you, Secretary Castro?
Well, I mean, these days I'm just lending my voice to causes and to candidates that I believe in, and I'm a MSNBC and NBC News analyst. I'm actually in DC. I want to thank you for providing this background because I'm actually in a hotel room in DC for the coverage tonight, and otherwise you would have seen a pretty boring hotel background. So thank you. I'm gonna continue to do that, and I may well jump back in to public service in the future. But for right now, I'm supporting others who are doing it well. And my wife Erica and I have a daughter who's about to turn 13 in a week and a half, and a son who just turned 7. So all y'all know that keeps you busy, keeps you on your toes. They're definitely keeping us busy these days. So I'm the silver lining for me during these last 2 years has been that I'd been on the road constantly at HUD and then on the campaign trail about 80% of the time. And so this has been a total 180 of that, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, I just want to say thank you personally and on behalf of the board of directors for My Dog Is My Home. You are an inspiration to us all, and we are so honored that you were here today. You are a leader, you're a champion for everything this community cares about, and we can't thank you enough for joining us. So a virtual round of applause for Secretary Julian Castro. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, y'all. Keep up the fight. Keep advocating.
Thank you. Stay healthy.
We'll do.